Props. We're back with Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America by Anne Braude. Sounds like something they'd play on Twilight Zone. The Meaning of Mediumship, Chapter 4. If anybody can guess what piece this is by Bach, you win 8 trillion pickles. It's obviously percussion, but the answer is it was the Fugue in C major by Bach. Bach. All right, let's get on with this book. Open the chat and see what happens. Chapter 4, The Meaning of Mediumship as it relates to spiritualism. The meaning of mediumship. Spiritualism's greatest contribution to the crusade for women's rights probably lay in the new role of spirit medium. While reformers talked about women's autonomy, mediumship cast women in a central public role in the new religion. Far from requiring guidance from men, mediums led both men and women on the path to truth. The example of mediums whose religious role encouraged them to take charge of their own lives reinforced the application of the principle of individual sovereignty to women. In mediumship, women's religious leadership became normative for the first time in American history. Yet mediums did not model a simple abrogation of accepted feminine norms. Instead, mediumship gave women a public leadership role that allowed them to remain compliant with the complex of values of the period that have come to be known as the cult of true womanhood. The cult of true womanhood asserted that woman's nature was characterized by purity, piety, passivity, and domesticity, while this ideology held that women were especially, don't fall asleep, buddy, were especially suited to religion, and that religion was especially important to women. It nevertheless required them to defer to men in all religious matters. Every Sunday, women saw more of their sisters than their brothers in the churches they attended, yet they, the majority of members, were excluded from all decisions regarding church operations. The religious instruction of the young was entrusted to them in Sunday schools, but they were forbidden to speak out loud during their regular services. Told to serve God through their influence in the home, they saw men rule an ungodly and immoral society outside the home. The increased leadership of women during the Second Great Awakening in the early decades of the 19th century deepened the existing contradictions. Women's spiritual prowess was affirmed, but they were still denied ordination or positions of authority in church organizations. Spiritualism embraced the notion that women were pious by nature, but instead of concluding that the qualities that suited women to religion unsuited them to public roles, spiritualism made the delicate constitution and nervous excitability commonly attributed to femininity a virtue and lauded it as a qualification for religious leadership. If women had special spiritual sensitivities, then it followed that they could sense spirits, which is precisely what mediums did. Right. 19th century stereotypes of femininity were used to bolster the case for female mediumship. Women in the 19th century are physically sick, weak, and declining, wrote one spiritualist leader. But if the functions depending on force and muscle are weak, the nerves are intensely sensitive. Hence, sickness, rest, passivity, susceptibility, impressionability, mediumship, communication, revelation. The very qualities that rendered women incompetent when judged against norms for masculine behavior rendered them capable of mediumship. Mediumship allowed women to discard limitations on women's role without questioning accepted ideas about women's nature. Let's read what this person wrote in there. Almost as if the role were given to placate them. Women did not consciously choose to be mediums. Rather, they and their co-religionists believed that the spirits chose them and that they passively allowed spirits to communicate through them. Even the process of becoming a medium was referred to in the passive form. One was said to be developed as a medium, the active role being attributed to spirits. Thus, the advent of mediumship did not require a decision to rebel against the domestic role. With the encouragement of spirits, women did things that they themselves believed women could not do. A medium in Philadelphia greeted her new calling with proper feminine hesitation. If it will make me better, purer, or more useful, I will welcome it. But I fear I am an unworthy servant and unfitted for so high a calling. She wrote to a more experienced medium. Spirit presence helped women overcome internal doubts as well as external sanctions. The medium Amanda Britt Spence, addressing a spiritualist convention, rejoiced that spiritualism had called out woman from the duties and trials in which none but angels could sympathize. She reported that women shrank from the new burdens occasioned by mediumship. Spence summed up the typical response to mediumship in the words, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine, O God, be done." But with whatever hesitation women might greet their new role, she concluded, there is no power to resist the overwhelming influences of the spirit world. Once spirits were in evidence, they could provide women with encouragement and motivation to assume leadership against public criticism. Emma Hardinge, a leading trance lecturer, see plate 8. Let's see her. I keep skipping these plates, but let's see Emma. Oh, they're more of the plates. Plate 8. I've skipped the first 7. Let's see plate 8. Which one's her? A medium and musician who became the historian of spiritualism. Who's this one? 17-year-old trance speaker who enchanted American audiences. Yeah, because she looks like a little movie star. Described how spirits overcame her own ideas about activities proper for women when she embarked on the lecture circuit. That I, a woman, and moreover, a lady by birth, and English above all, that I would go out like strong-minded women and hector the world on public platforms. Oh, shocking. I vowed rebellion to give up spiritualism, and America, to return to England and live a feminine existence once again. With these magnanimous resolves upon me, 1 week, the next saw me on a public platform, fairly before the world as a trance speaker. With spirit guidance, women spoke in public, wrote books, and went on lecture tours. Mary Dana Schindler, for example, visited a test medium in New York and asked the spirits, "Do you wish me to write the work I am thinking of?" "Yes, go on. It will sell well," was the encouraging reply. She took the spirits' advice and wrote A Southerner Among the Spirits. As mediums, women became sources of religious truth and, as such, assumed the authority of religious leaders. Spirits, it seemed, encouraged women to do things that other forces militated against. Mediumship circumvented the structural barriers that excluded women from religious leadership. By communicating directly with spirits, mediums bypassed the need for education, ordination, or organizational recognition, which secured the monopoly of male religious leaders. While men might bar women from church councils or from theological education, human authority could not supersede communication, carried its own authority. Could not supersede that given to mediums by the spirits who spoke through them. Spirit communication carried its own authority. If one accepted the message, one had little choice but to accept the medium. Let's see what the footnotes of the person who previously owned the book. Did women truly believe they were in contact with spirits, or was this all a show, a conspiracy? I would say some believed it and some were just trying to make money. Trance speakers. Spiritualism departed from accepted social norms by encouraging women to speak in public. But the manner in which they spoke had a cultural significance of its own. Equal numbers of men and women spoke from the spiritualist platform, both on the lecture circuit and at conventions, picnics, and grove meetings. But speakers observed a rigorous sexual division of labor. Men called meetings to order, forcefully presiding over gatherings that could number in the thousands. They addressed audiences in a normal state, expressing their own views on spiritualist subjects. In contrast, the women at the podium were unconscious. What? Trance mediums were understood to be passive vehicles whose physical faculties were used by spirits to express the sentiments of those unseen intelligences. Mediums presented not their own views, but those of the spirits who spoke through them. The juxtaposition of men officiating at large assemblies with unconscious women voicing extemporaneous visions of heaven in verse both satisfied existing sexual stereotypes and pushed them a step further. The essential passivity of women was asserted in a public arena, displayed before thousands of witnesses. Sparse qualifications in a trance speaker reinforced the claim that the lecturer originated not with the speaker but with spirits, while men qualified for the public platform by wisdom, education, and experience, trans speakers qualified by innocence, ignorance, and youth. The fact that a woman stood up in public and gave a lecture in itself evidenced spirit agency, since few believed a woman could do such a thing unaided. A correspondent to the Banner of Light argued that the doctrines of spiritualism must be true because the great lady trans speakers, Rosa Amity, Cora Hatch, Emma Hardinge, Emily Beebe, or is it Beebe, Emma J. Boolin, and Anna Henderson, have never been able nor even attempted, as far as we know, to give such lectures in the normal state. A New York City lecture by Emma J., later Boleyn, given in the abnormal state, offered one clear example that a young lady not over 18 years of age could speak for an hour and a quarter in such an eloquent manner with such logical and philosophical clearness, proved to one observer the presence of a power not natural in the education or mentality of the speaker. Women, in contrast to men, could be public teachers of religion without education because they were pious by nature. That brings up a good point that public teachers, a lot of women were the public teachers. So, I mean, they did have to speak in public, but they normally spoke to children. Anyway, according to the well-respected trans speaker, Lizzie Doughton, woman does not need to cultivate her intellect in order to perceive spiritual truths. Let her live only true to her divine nature and her spiritual perceptions. Make a home in your heart for God, Doughton told the women in her audience, and his angels shall come, and all that is needed for spiritual perception and development comes in with that inspiration. I want to read these notes that someone wrote. We assume inability first, not that there might be other reasons for the lack of it. Solicited, what the hell does that mean? Passivity? I can't read that. Chicken scratch. Reactions were ignored. The hell does that say? Passivity, I think. Anyway, back to the text. Let me grab my bell. She conceded that women received inadequate education, but she did not view lack of training. Let me get this. Lack of training as a block to religious leadership. Woman has been forced into a narrow circle of life, a dull routine of duties, and that is declared to be woman's sphere, Doughton complained. But God does not wait for this education. He has made woman a religious teacher. Doughton predicted correctly that as the generations pass, there shall be women as well as men with these exceptional educations. But the training that prepared men to become religious leaders could never replace the unconscious inspiration that gave women direct access to religious knowledge. Ultimately, Doughton believed all people would recognize the superiority of women's natural piety in trance to male theological education. She is the divine Shekinah, the Holy of Holies. In her man shall recognize the image of his God and kneel and adore, although the views expressed here are consistent with those Doughton expressed while conscious. Oh, man, she was conscious. They were delivered in trance. Youth also proved that the trance medium did not compose her own speech. Cora Hatch, who under a variety of married names became one of the most celebrated trance speakers of the 19th century, made her first appearance at the age of 11 years old, in 1851 in Lake Mills, Wisconsin, and spoke throughout the state the following year. At 14, she was employed as a regular speaker by a spiritualist society in Buffalo, New York, a position that she held for 2 years. She then moved to New York City, which became her base for tours to the major cities of the East and Midwest by the age of 17. 14-year-old Flora Temple of Bennington, Vermont, traveled to the Rutland Free Convention to speak in trance. Though apparently in a normal state. Before several hundred people in 1858, Susie Kluwer, age 13, was popular for her poetic presentations. For audiences that had never witnessed a woman speaking in public, the spectacle of a teenage girl at the podium must have appeared impressive, if not miraculous. Martha Hewlett, a farmer's daughter from Illinois, began her career at 16 and was lecturing as far away as Tennessee by 18. Where was the footnote? I didn't even see it. The hell was it? I don't know. Anyway, I'll read it. Born Cora Lynn Victoria Scott, this popular medium entered the public record under her birth name and under those of 4 successive husbands, Hatch, Daniels, Tappan, and Richmond. Her contemporaries always referred to her by the name of her current husband. In order not to confuse the reader, I generally refer to her as Cora Hatch because it was under that name that she initially created the public sensation. Anyway, back to Martha Hewlett. A biographical account in 1860 observed that she is now 20 but looks 16. Similarly, Mrs. Nellie Wiltsey, a 23-year-old trance speaker who was described as a small girl-like woman, a youthful appearance in addition to actual youth added to a medium's credibility and to the impression she made on her audience. Observers testified over and over to the visual impact of a woman, especially a young and beautiful woman, at the podium. Cora Hatch's golden curls became among the best documented facts of modern spiritualism. An engraving depicting Cora Hatch with flowing ringlets, bare shoulders, and a large cross hanging from a chain around her neck, see Plate 9, was widely reproduced, including in the biography by Harrison D. Barrett, Life Work of Mrs. Cora v. L.V. Richmond, and in Emma Hardinge, Modern American Spiritualism. Scandalous, they write. 1869 reprint. Yeah, she was pretty, so that's why people listened to her. Youth was also considered to reduce the motivation for fraud. Skeptics have more faith in that which is given through children than older mediums. Listen, I ain't going to listen to any 11-year-old telling me they're talking to the dead. Because they consider, actually, I probably would listen to it. It'd probably be pretty hilarious. Because they consider there is less ability as well as less desire to practice trickery and deception in the child than in the adult, wrote a Banner of Light correspondent about Laura Ellis, who became a medium at 11. Youth associated the medium with the innocence of childhood, just as domestic ideology contrasted women and children with the worldliness of men. The 18-year-old Fanny Burbank was described as the personification of purity. She is very childlike in her manners, observed a member of the audience, which simplicity and innocence makes her very attractive. Not all trance speakers were so young. Mediums began careers at all ages, and those who began as children often continued for decades. Many trance speakers were young matrons in their 20s, but even the 30-year-old Aksa Sprague attracted considerable attention for her attractive appearance at the podium. In general, spiritualists considered the trance to be an elevated state, providing access to spirits and therefore to knowledge of the world beyond inaccessible to conscious human beings. But some question the accuracy of revelations received in trance because the ability to give a trance lecture depended on one's susceptibility to outside influences. The moral accountability of trance speakers was sometimes questioned. If trance speakers were merely passive vehicles, could they be held responsible for their behavior while in trance or for the content of their messages? The unaccountability of mediums was sometimes urged as an excuse for questionable behavior or even for fraud. When a young medium was discovered faking manifestations while she was supposed to be inside a bag nailed to the floor, a leading spiritualist explained that it is possible for a medium, when in a trance state, to become an unconscious and irresponsible instrument in the hands of a controlling spirit. Presumably, a fraudulent spirit from the lower spheres controlled this medium. Because of the unaccountability of mediums controlled by unseen intelligences, an editorial in the Spiritual Age asserted that the trance was not the optimum condition for spirit communication. It viewed the trance as higher than the normal state, but lower than conscious state inspiration. The editor accepted that in the unconscious trance, a person may be susceptible to spirit influence or controlled by a spirit power, and thus be used to furnish evidence of spirit's existence and presence, and to give utterance to spiritual truths, but concluded that in a more advanced and spiritualized condition, one can do all this and more, and yet be fully awake and conscious. By questioning the trance state, critics questioned the values and assumptions that fostered female leadership. The assertion that the passivity that gave women access to spirits made them morally unaccountable undercut women's claim to spiritual authority. Two correspondents dissented from the editor's disparaging opinion of trance speaking. Their views more accurately reflect the role of the trance speaker in the spread and practice of spiritualism. One reminded the editor that your patrons in this state have, as a general thing, been converts of trance speaking, and you, I think, pay those laborers a poor compliment. Trance speakers were the missionaries of spiritualism, and their far-reaching itinerancy aided the rapid spread of the movement. Their lectures, often free to the public, might attract hundreds of people, while the seances of test mediums could accommodate only as many people as could fit around a table. Trance speaking in an unconscious state is one of the most exalted, the most reliable, the most convincing as to its origins of any manifestation connected with the human organism. Wrote the second correspondent, finally, the spiritualist public had faith in their mediums and was unconcerned by critics' doubts about the trance state, although more serious challenges to their leadership would emerge following the Civil War. Trance speakers enjoyed the support of the mass of believers during the 1850s. While descriptions suggest that some mediums were able to enter a trance spontaneously, trance speakers never developed consistent modes of trance behavior. According to observers, it was Cora Hatch's practice to enter the hall already in trance. During the preliminaries to her lecture, she sat gazing upwards with her eyes intently fixed. At the close of her lecture, she looked and stared about her like one just awakened. But other mediums who claimed to be in trance provided little evidence of an abnormal state. Because audiences were accustomed to viewing the trance as proof of spirit inspiration, a reporter describing the appearance of a lecturer in Boston felt compelled to explain that although Mrs. Warner is a conscious trance speaker, she is entirely subject to the control of spirit influence while delivering her discourses. Flora Temple was described as being in trance, although she appeared to be in a normal state. Martha Hewlett was described as a conscious trance speaker because she was able to hear what she said while she was speaking, because the trance was viewed as enabling women to speak who were otherwise unqualified to do so. The claim of entrancement became a convention used to support women's rights and ability to ascend the public platform. Is this on? Yes, the light was on. Trance speakers emphasized what they said rather than what they did. While test mediums might curse and swagger when controlled by the spirits of drunkards or sailors, trance speakers viewed the content of their speeches as well as the act of speaking as inspired. High-toned trance speakers like Lizzie Doughton and Aksa I'll never know how to say it, ACHSA, Oxa Sprague did not give private sittings and did not receive messages from individually identifiable spirits, nor did they produce the common physical manifestations of raps or table tipping. According to Lizzie Doughton, the external phenomena of modern spiritualism, compared to the great principles underlying them, are but mere froth and foam on the ocean of truth. Unlike the test medium, the trance speaker might hold herself above the external phenomena of spiritualism and dwell on the great principles underlying them. Doughton's description of the trance itself portrays the medium as someone who has access to the wisdom of departed spirits rather than as someone who passively communicates their views. The avenues of external sense, if not closed, were at least disused in order that the spiritual perception might be quickened to the required degree, and also that the world of causes of which the earth and its experiences are but the passing effects might be disclosed to my vision. Certain it is that a physical change took place, affecting both my breathing and my circulation. Some trance lectures did not even mention spiritual phenomena, but were composed of religious sentiments that could have been voiced by any popularizer of a vague transcendentalism. Antebellum Americans flocked to hear trance speakers discourse on spiritual subjects just as they flocked to be enlightened by the popular lectures of Ralph Waldo Emerson. The entrancement of the audience. Congregationalist Antoinette Brown Blackwell made a sensation as a speaker in 1853 when she became the first woman to be ordained as a minister. She wrote to Lucy Stone that she could get any price for lectures after Horace Greeley reported in the New York Tribune that she had officiated at the first marriage to be performed by a woman. Just 6 years later, when she attempted to return to the lecture field following the birth of her first child, she wrote to Stone that I have been coolly told over and over again that the time was when I stood first as a preacher, but now a host of women, most spiritualists, have gone ahead of me. The host of women who superseded her on the lecture circuit between 1853 and 1859 were predominantly trance speakers. Trance speakers made their appearance in the early 1850s and served as the primary public representatives of spiritualism during that decade. The right of women to speak in public was hotly contested during the antebellum period, following the historic anti-slavery lectures of the Grimke sisters in 1837. A few fearless reform women ventured before the public during the 1840s, most notably Ernestine Rose, Abby Kelly Foster, Lucretia Mott, and at the end of the decade, Lucy Stone. Novelist Elizabeth Oakes Smith became a popular literary lyceum lecturer. In addition, a few women, such as the holiness preacher Phoebe Palmer and the Black Methodist Jarena Lee, appeared in public as Christian evangelists. Many of the pioneer women platform speakers relied on spiritual guidance similar to that depended on by mediums. This group included Quakers who were prompted by the inner light and visionaries who obeyed an inner voice. Jarena Lee, e.g., heard a voice say, "Preach the gospel. I will put words in your mouth." Black evangelist Zilpah Elaw made her first public address in 1817. Following a trance, Jarena Lee, Religious Experiences and Journals of Mrs. Jarena Lee, giving account of her call to preach the gospel. Philadelphia, Jarena Lee, 1849. I guess the rest of it's just titles. However, the right of women to address promiscuous assemblies composed of both men and women was still generally denied. Clerical opponents cited Paul's injunction to the Corinthians that women should keep silent in church to argue both against women preaching and against women speaking in public in general. Because speaking in public contradicted biblical mandate, it was viewed as a subversion of God's intended ordering of the relations of men and women on earth. The General Association of Congregational Ministers of Massachusetts responded to the 1837 public appearance of the Grimsby sisters with a pastoral letter describing the dangers which at present seem to threaten the female character with widespread and permanent injury. The letter predicted that women speaking in public would lead to degeneracy and ruin. They weren't wrong about that. But degeneracy and ruin were coming regardless, and censured any of that sex who so far forget themselves as to itinerate in the character of public lecturers. Both advocates and opponents of women speaking in public viewed it as a fundamental issue in the debate over women's role. Conservative male religious leaders continued to debate the propriety of women speaking in mixed assemblies throughout the century. Even reform circles opposed women's public speaking. The refusal of anti-slavery and temperance conventions to allow women to speak provided an important catalyst to the founding of the women's rights movement. Although radical Garrisonians supported women as speakers, the abolition movement split over the issue of women's participation, and some of the most heated feeling focused on women's right to speak in public. Oberlin College, where reform principles required that Lucy Stone be admitted as a student, refused to let her speak at commencement in 1847. Although unanimously elected by her fellow students to give a graduation address, she refused to write one rather than have it read for her by a male professor, as school policy dictated. The practice of having a man read was followed by the more proper Catherine Beecher, whose brother read her lectures, and by Emma Willard and Dorothea Dix. Antoinette Brown's appearance on the platform of the World's Temperance Convention in 1853 brought the meeting to a halt. Delegates who objected to women speaking in public kept the hall in chaos for an hour and a half. In spite of derision, abuse, and severe clerical opposition, women established a presence on the American platform during the 1850s. Trance mediums were an important element in the emergence of women as public speakers during the 1850s. Although a few abolitionist women preceded them, trance speakers outnumbered reform women lecturers by the end of the 1850s. When scholar Lillian O'Connor scoured the country's archives for texts of early speeches given by women, she found speeches by only 21 women, all of them reformers. O'Connor included only speakers for whom she could find extant texts of speeches in contemporary publications or in the handwriting of the speaker. This may have excluded some speakers, however. Her list includes some reform women who rarely spoke, such as Martha Coffin Wright and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who did not appear in public frequently until the 1860s. In a more recent study, Blanche Hirsch identified 51 women as antebellum abolitionist feminists, only half of whom spoke in public with any regularity before the Civil War. And most of these were included in O'Connor's list of 21. When the Banner of Light started printing lists of lecturers in 1860, it began with 23 women in January and listed 52 women lecturers by the end of the year. The Spiritual Register for 1859 listed the names of over 100 women trance speakers in 11 states. This did not include all the dozens of women whose careers could be followed in the spiritualist press. Women began to deliver lectures in trance shortly after the advent of spirit communication. Mrs. G.B. Bushnell spoke in the abnormal state in Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania in 1850 and was still on the lecture circuit in 1852. In Chicago, a medium, Mrs. Herrick, became an excellent but exceedingly radical lecturer in the early 1850s. Mrs. Amanda Britt Spence gave trance lectures every Sunday in St. Louis. Beginning in 1852, by the mid-1850s, trance lectures could be heard weekly at the regular meetings of spiritualist societies in a number of cities. In addition, several spiritualist women, such as Cora Scott, later Hatch, in Buffalo, Axa Sprague in South Reading, Vermont, and Charlotte M. Beebe, later Wilbur, in Milwaukee, had permanent positions as regular lecturers. Antoinette Brown Blackwell tried to secure such an arrangement where she could preach weekly reform sermons for free in New York City in 1859, but no backer would underwrite the cost of the hall. In contrast, a relatively obscure medium, Ella E. Gibson, filled the concert hall in Augusta, Maine for 6 consecutive evenings. Manchester, New Hampshire boasted seven trance speakers in 1858, 5 of them women. A correspondent complained to the Banner of Light that 2 of Manchester's best speakers, Emmeline Houston and Susan Johnson, had gone to Massachusetts to lecture. Trance speakers received considerable attention in the press. Newspapers that found the lectures of reform women too improper to notice nonetheless covered appearances by trans speakers. What's up, brovs? Aren't you like 7 years old? Shouldn't you be in bed, buddy? Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, alone among New York papers, noticed women's rights and abolition lectures. But by 1858, Greeley found this practice too controversial to continue. Not even the more conservative of the anti-slavery papers, the National Era, would print an abolitionist lecture if it was delivered by a woman. Yet trans speakers received extensive press notice, both positive and negative. She spake as woman never spake before, said the Daily Sun, Columbus, Georgia, of Emma Hardinge's trance lecture in that city. Hi, nah, I am with my dad. Yo, what's up, Dad? Spiritualists embarked the platform as an alternative to the pulpit. Trans speaker and feminist Charlotte Beebe Wilbur called the platform the People's Arena, the Democratic pulpit, observing that a stand point so high and inaccessible as the pulpit may seem fit for the solitary despot whose empire it has sometimes served. Here on the platform, virtue is the only strength, reason the only test, and spiritual power the only exaltation. Not only was the pulpit dictatorial and authoritative, but it was also, of course, closed to women. The platform, in contrast, provided an outlet for anyone who could attract an audience with or without church sanction. As trans speakers, women who could not speak in church took advantage of a secular format to deliver a religious message. Lizzie Doughton thought the platform superior to the pulpit, not only because it admitted women, but also because it was a better vehicle for spiritual enlightenment. In a trance lecture on the biblical text, "It is a shame for women to speak in the church," Doughton exclaimed. "It is indeed a shame for women to speak in the church, and woman ought to be ashamed of the church. Let woman come out from the church, and when she comes out, the minister and all the congregation will go out with her." The sight of a lone woman confidently expounding spiritual truths enchanted American listeners. No report can give any fair idea of the spirit presence, of the self-possessed dignity, clearness, promptness, wrote one observer, who nevertheless remained skeptical about spirit communication. Speaking mediums entranced audiences in major cities and small towns throughout the North. For listeners, the trance lecture might be both the first exposure to spiritualism and the first exposure to a woman speaking in public. The new religion was therefore joined in the mind of the audience with the creation of a public role for women. The visibility of trans speakers as pioneer women orators was sufficient to convince the Methodist missionary W.M. Leftwich that the first female lecturers and public speakers were spiritualists. Leftwich made this remark with disapproval in his account of his itinerancy in Missouri in the mid-1850s. Confirming the chronology of the advent of trans speakers suggested by Antoinette Brown Blackwell, the impact of trans speakers reached far beyond the community of believers. They reached a broad audience composed of the cult, the curious, and the skeptical, as well as the faithful. The popular writer Nathaniel Parker Willis attended a lecture by the noted medium Cora Hatch one evening when the opera he had planned to attend was canceled. He described her with admiration in the Home Journal as a delicate featured blonde of 17 or 18, flaxen ringlets falling over her shoulders, movements deliberate and self-possessed, voice calm and deep, and eyes and fingers no way nervous. Willis was impressed by her beauty and her platform presence, but he was also impressed by the departure from the female role she made by speaking in public. Very curious it was, he wrote, to see a long-haired young woman standing alone in the pulpit, her face turned upwards, her delicate bare arms raised in a clergyman's attitude of devotion, and a church full of people listening attentively while she prayed. Willis then recalled the biblical injunction against women preaching. He knew his audience well and knew the significance that they would find in Hatch's appearance. He, however, felt that the extraordinary qualities of the speaker justified Hatch's abrogation of the biblical injunction. He explained his conclusion with an appeal to the spiritual superiority of 19th-century women. But my instinctive feeling, I must own, made no objection to the propriety of the performance. The tone and manner were of absolute sincerity of devoutness, which compelled respect, and before she closed, I was prepared to believe her an exception, either that a male spirit was speaking through her lips, or that the relative position of the sexes is not the same as in the days of St. Paul. How was it with the Corinthians? Women are certainly better than we in these latter days, and as standing far nearer God may properly speak for us, even in holy places, or so it seemed to me while listening to Mrs. Hatch. All right, buddy. Sleep tight, Bubba. Willis did not report the content of Hatch's lecture, explaining that it was available in the daily papers. He did dwell on her mode of presentation and most especially on her use of language. Her precise use of words and her confident fluency convinced Willis that whether she spoke her own thoughts or those of other spirits, it is as nearly supernatural eloquence as the most hesitating faith could reasonably require. Willis wrote not as a spiritualist, but rather as an outsider who regarded the movement with suspicion. He reminded his readers that his past experience with spiritualism had been unsatisfactory, and that the Fox sisters and others have tried their spells on me in vain. He may not have been convinced of the reality of spirit communication by Cora Hatch's trance lecture, but he was convinced of the ability of a womanly woman to speak in public, and particularly of the appropriateness of her speaking on spiritual subjects. That's pretty huge, says the person who owned the book. Willis was not the only New Yorker enchanted by Cora Hatch, although the New York Times thought her spirits talked errant, I don't know what A-R-R-A-N-T, errant transcendentalism of the diluted kind. The paper consistently reported her lectures, indicating that they did interest the public, if not the editor. She succeeded in impressing even the notorious Tammany ruffian Captain Rinders, who was on the committee from the audience that selected the topic for one of Hatch's first lectures in New York. The committee, as usual, was asked afterward whether they were satisfied with Hatch's answers to the questions they had proposed. Rinders replied that he had come believing Hatch to be a humbug, but now had the highest possible regard for the lady's talent. He declared that her prayer was beautiful, her theory profound, and her language eloquent. Like Willis, Rinders was not completely convinced by what Hatch said, but he was very impressed with the way she said it. Also, like Willis, he changed his attitude about the appropriateness of women speaking on spiritual subjects. He declared that he had never heard so beautiful and touching an exhortation from any pulpit. W.M. Lefwich, the Methodist missionary, agreed with Willis in associating spiritualism's introduction of women onto the public platform with the creation of a new religious role for women. After observing that the first female lecturers in Missouri were spiritualists, he went on to note in the same sentence that in the spiritualists' church, so-called, women are the high priests, and the scriptural teachings in regard to the relation of men and women and their duties in the church are reversed. He and Lizzie Doden agreed that women should not speak in church, but for very different reasons. Reform women also responded enthusiastically to trans speakers. The suffragist Abigail Scott Duniway wrote in her newspaper, The New Northwest, that the trans speaker Belle Chamberlain excelled both Henry Ward Beecher, all right, it is right, both Henry Ward Beecher and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in eloquence and logic. Duniway was sympathetic to spiritualists because they always invited her to speak on women's suffrage at their conventions, but she was not an adherent of the movement and ridiculed mediums whose spirits directed them on questionable paths. Nevertheless, she was thoroughly impressed by trans speakers who toured the Pacific Northwest. Of medium Addie Ballou, she wrote, "While we do not endorse all or half her doctrines, we've never yet heard two men who could equal her in arguments or eloquence." A hostile writer for the New York Tribune ridiculed the other speakers at an 1858 spiritualist convention, but found medium Amanda Britt Spence an orator of rare power and accomplishment, whose speech was far more eloquent and impressive than any other feminine address to which I ever listened. He reported that several ladies came with streaming eyes to thank the orator and yield assent to sentiments and opinions advanced. When Paulina Wright Davis recalled the first 20 years of the campaign for women's rights at the 1871 National Convention, the only person she included in her account who had not been publicly identified with the women's rights movement was the trans speaker Cora Hatch, then using the name of her current husband, Tappan. Davis included Hatch because she had spoken more frequently and to larger audiences than almost any other lecturer. As did most observers, Davis commented on Hatch's femininity. Femininity? Is that a word? Femininity? Never identified with any party, she has, nevertheless, done a great work in a most womanly way. By including Hatch in her account of the women's rights movement, Davis acknowledged the impact that trans mediums had merely because they were women who spoke in public and spoke well. Not everyone accepted the trans speakers' messages, but they were widely accepted as skilled and effective speakers. For a woman to defy convention and mount the public platform required tremendous self-confidence. Spirit mediumship emboldened women to overcome internal fears about their capabilities, as well as external social strictures. The calm confidence born of spirit guidance contrasted with the insecurity that kept most women off the public platform and continued to plague some who took the giant step to the podium. Sally Holly, for example, spoke regularly on anti-slavery from 1851 until the Civil War, but never lost her fear of lecturing. Matilda Jocelyn Gage was trembling in every limb when she delivered her first public lecture and spoke so softly that few could follow her carefully prepared text. After this experience, she confined herself principally to written statements. Susan B. Anthony became a skilled orator by the end of the 1850s, but never overcame her self-doubt on the platform. Anthony questioned her ability to hold an audience, but at least she possessed sufficient volume to make herself heard. This was true of so few of her early colleagues that the impatient Anthony introduced a motion at the 1852 Woman's Right Convention, requiring that those who could not make themselves heard give their speeches to others to read, because it is an imposition on an audience to have to sit quietly through a long speech of which they cannot hear one word. The idea that women should speak audibly in public was controversial even at the Woman's Right Convention. Paulina Wright Davis opposed Anthony's motion because ladies did not come there to screech. They came to behave like ladies and to speak like ladies. Well, she's got a point. Trans speakers presented a very different image of the female lecturer. Observers were surprised if a medium faltered on the platform. When the 17-year-old Martha Brown Sawyer spoke at the Melodeon Hall in Boston, a reporter commented that her voice had not yet matured and that she had therefore not yet attained that pleasant volume which characterized many of our female speakers. Because of their speaking skills, trans mediums were often asked to preside at funerals and weddings. And the person says, wow! The flowing speech of trans mediums depended on a self-assurance unavailable to mid-century women who lacked spiritual inspiration. Their ability to address unknown topics chosen by the audience without preparation set them apart from other lecturers. Even the silver-tongued Lucy Stone, among the most self-assured of women reform speakers, repeated the same 3 lectures in rotation on her early tours. Susan B. Anthony, plagued with inconfidence as a speaker, read from a prepared text when she appeared in public in these years. In 1855, on a canvas of New York State, she read the same speech in every town, half in the evening and half in the afternoon. Anthony envied the easy eloquence of the trance speaker. Oh, dear, dear, if the spirits would only just make me a trance medium and put the right thing into my mouth, she wrote to her co-worker and confidant, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You can't think how earnestly I have prayed to be made a speaking medium for a whole week. If they would only come to me thus, I'd give them a hearty welcome. Fearful that she would not know what to say before an audience, she entreated Stanton to prepare a text for her to read at an upcoming convention. Anthony was undecided on the question of spiritualism at this time, but she was full of admiration for the abilities of trance mediums. In 1857, when Cora Hatch made a sensation in New York City, the Reform platform had lost many of its foremost women orators. Lucy Stone, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were home with infant children. There was no women's rights convention that year for lack of speakers, although the Banner of Light also occasionally mourned the loss of a gifted speaker to marriage or motherhood. New recruits quickly filled her place. This problem was a pet peeve of Warren Chase, who complained of medium Emma J. in 1861 that she is not dead but married, and mortals, not angels, are using her now. However, Emma J. Boulin was back on the lecture circuit by 1863. New names appeared regularly in the Banner's list of lecturers, replacing lost laborers in the cause. Later generations of spiritualists would become preoccupied with sensational phenomena produced in private circles. But before the Civil War, trance lecturers such as Cora Hatch, Lizzie Doughton, and Emma Hardinge were the undisputed favorites of the spiritualist public. Likewise, the general public, enchanted by trance speakers in the 1850s could go elsewhere to hear a woman speak in public after the Civil War. Yet the enthusiastic response accorded to trans speakers helped open the way for women to speak in other roles. The meteoric career of the 17-year-old reform sensation Anna Dickinson in the 1860s, for example, married the rise of popular trans speakers of the previous decade more than it resembled the careers of other reformers. Women who began as trance speakers sometimes learned to speak out of trance, and several became reform lecturers, but the progression never went in the other direction. Many reform women became spiritualists, but none became trance speakers. Women who possessed the self-assurance to speak without spirit assistance did not seek it out later. Oh, man. In life, trans speaking was a transitional phase that enabled both individual women and women as a group to break through limitations on their role. It embodied a combination of feminine qualities with a departure from the feminine role that had a strong appeal to both men and women in the 1850s. Maybe I'll stop here since this is a new section. I was going to stop after this page anyway. How many pages does this go? 116. That'd be 17 pages, and I read 17 pages. Yeah, I'll stop here. Perfect. All right, Robs. Goodbye. Guten Abend.